30 years ago, an American convict who escaped from a prison in Michigan went on an incredible run of bank and jewelry store robberies, 59 in total. He was eventually arrested in Pembroke, at the Pembroke area airport on June 12, 1987. He became known as the Flying Bandit. Tonight, that story with Ed Arnold, the man who broke the story as the former editor of the Peterborough Examiner. Welcome to Algonquin College and the speaker series, Ed.
Thanks for having me, Jamie.
We're going to get right into it, but just before I do that, I understand this is your first visit back to Pembroke since that case.
It is. I toured the city today. I couldn't believe how much was missing. Wally's isn't there, Beef and Brand isn't there, all the places the bandit went to isn't there, except his house. His house is still there, yeah.
And you drove by there today?
Yeah, I had to see it again.
Interesting. Who was Gilbert Galvan?
Gilbert Galvan has a terrible background, as you can well expect. I mean, he's a career criminal. But when he was small, he grew up with a family of 7 children. His father was not pleasant. His mother had some issues, and they had a stepfather join them, and he used to beat them up. And the sister told me that he beat them till he bled. And Gilbert had, even with all those problems, he still found time when the children didn't have a Christmas tree or gifts. Even when he was a young teenager, he would go out and get a Christmas tree for the family and gifts. But there was one very sad moment when the children were in court, and the mother arrived, and they thought she was going to take them back. And they all ran to her and hugged her, and she said, "Just a second, I have to go get a soda." And they never saw her again for 7 years. So he was in training school, he was in military schools, he got kicked out of the military school. He would have liked to get kicked out of the training school, but he was in custody then. And he found out that the best way to make money was to steal it. And he started early in his career and used a lot of aliases, and he used a lot of women. And when he got arrested in Three Rivers, Michigan, he was doing a Western Union job. It's funny, we drove into Pembroke today and I saw the Western Union sign. I said, wow, he wants to come back here. But he was doing a Western Union scam, and he was living with a woman who knew him as Butch. And he borrowed her car because he said he had a job interview. And he got caught, arrested in Three Rivers. And he was on parole as it was for 8 years, and he escaped from a prison in Three Rivers. He had a friend drive him across the border in Canada. In those days, passports weren't necessary or anything, and he hitchhiked from Windsor after a night out with his buddy, and went to Toronto, found a homeless person from Calgary, and borrowed his ID. For the next 3 years, he became Robert Whiteman. And he didn't like Toronto, too big, and he moved to Ottawa. And that's where the story began.
So this is 1984 when he escapes from prison and comes across into Canada.
Right.
His original plan, though, is to go to Vancouver, not Ottawa.
His original plan was to get to Vancouver. He had a friend there that said he could get him a job, I think on a ship, but I'm not sure what the job was, but he thought he could get a job out there.
And Vancouver is actually where he robs his first bank.
Yeah, he first of all, he gets into Ottawa and doesn't have a place to stay, and he goes into a hostel, and he meets this woman, and they like each other, and he doesn't have a job yet, and he sees he's outside looking for jobs. He wants to go straight at the time, and he saw this guy driving a Mr. Frosty bicycle. You know, they sell the ice creams, and he went and got a job for Mr. Frosty driving the bicycle and selling the ice creams. So that was his first job in Canada, and he ended up stealing the owner's ID, the SIN card, and his birth certificate, and he used that later to get a passport. But he rode bikes and sold ice cream, and then he got a construction job, and he got friendlier with this woman. They started liking each other, but he found he was getting too close to her, so he got on a bus and went to Vancouver, hoping that he'd get a job out there. There was nothing there when he got there. He was sitting on a park bench across from a bank in Vancouver, looked at it and said, well, maybe, and had a couple of drinks and went into the bank, robbed it, $625. Not a big haul for the Flying Bandit. And thought, well, this isn't too bad, I got away with it. And at that time, he just put a wig on and a ball cap, and that was it. And then he went to Calgary and robbed another bank, $4,000. Well, that's going to get him back to Ottawa. He calls the woman and says he's coming back. His dad has hired him to be a stocks and bond courier. And so he has a job doing that now, and I'll be home. And he went home, and they got together, and that's how it all started.
And it became almost like an addiction, the highs of quick money.
Yeah.
But he became a master of disguise.
Master of disguise. The bank jobs were an adrenaline rush. He found that he was getting a high on it. But to this day, he would say there was only one reason he was doing it, money. He said he knew right from wrong, but he wanted to rob banks because he'd get money. But he devised disguises that he even showed the woman he was living with the disguises, because that was part of his job as a stocks and bond courier. And he put on the wigs, he put on fake skin, mustaches, but he put on a suit. And then he'd put construction outfit on over the suit, or maybe comes in as a hippie, or maybe something else, maybe army fatigues, and he'd go into the bank, rob the bank, come out, go into an alleyway, take off his construction stuff, put his stuff in a case, walk out in a three-piece suit, and the police would be there by now. He'd go up to the police and say, what's going on? And they'd say, get lost, there's a bank robbery, we don't want you around here. Okay, fine. And he'd walk away, and then he'd go golfing, or he'd go drinking. And
But they were all very well planned. He would look
yeah.
for a certain
Yeah.
bank. He wanted to make sure the escape route was just right, and
Yeah.
the location mattered.
yeah, he robbed one bank in Peterborough 3 times. Same bank, same teller, different disguises. And each time he came in, they hadn't changed the security whatsoever. There was no security. There was no video, there was no surveillance, there was no nothing. He figured the third time there'd be something, nothing. So he robbed it again and went around the same alleyway, down the same stairwell, changed his clothes. Before he came into one bank job, he was dressed as a hippie, and the Peterborough guy rolled down his window on his pickup truck and yelled, "Get out of here, hippie!" And he just looked and smiled and went in and robbed the bank. Then he went over to the Lift Lock Golf Land and shot a few balls and drove home in his Chrysler.
And this is where you would have started to pick up on your interest in this story, because you were the editor of the Peterborough Examiner, and there's 3 bank robberies in your town.
Yeah, 3 bank robberies, and unfortunately, a man got charged with them. Innocent man. The police raided his home. He had guns in his house. He had $20 bills in his house. They had the teller come into the police station, go through the books, and she stopped at his picture and said, "I think that's the guy." He got charged with the bank robberies. He spent 4 days in jail and then months waiting for his preliminary. And when the day his preliminary was supposed to start, the charges were withdrawn. The court wouldn't say why, the police wouldn't say why, and that's when I became more interested.
And we'll get to that part of the story first, but first a few more stories around the Flying Bandit. Everything didn't always work out. Let's start with the story of when he planned to go to New Brunswick and ended up in Newfoundland.
Yeah, that was a great one. So he took Air Canada quite a bit. One time he was going to St. John, New Brunswick. He wouldn't rob a bank. He robbed a bank in every province except for Newfoundland and PEI, because he was afraid of getting off them. So he had to have an escape plan. So he was going to St. John, New Brunswick, gets on Air Canada. He was half sloshed, he said, and he uses the word sloshed, and went to sleep in the plane. As they're landing, the guy beside him said, "What brings you to Newfoundland?" He said, "Newfoundland? I'm not going to Newfoundland." He said, "Yeah, you are. You're landing in St. John's, Newfoundland." He said, "No, I'm not." So he talked to the stewardess, and it was Air Canada's mistake. So what he was concerned about was all his disguises and his guns were in the bag, which was under the plane, of course. and that had to be transported to St. John, New Brunswick. They guaranteed that it would be, and they gave him a ticket to St. John, New Brunswick, and as an apology, gave him a ticket to anywhere Air Canada flew. He was, by the end, he was a 100,000-mile club. He was on the Aeroplan. He was one of their best customers.
There's another story as well when he ends up having to take a train back from a robbery because things didn't work out. And the train, unfortunately, went into the United States.
Yeah, he didn't have much luck with that one. And that was the same one. It was the New Brunswick one. And he
Right
robbed
after
the bank.
Newfoundland,
He robbed the bank with $1,600 when he got to New Brunswick. And he was unhappy with that little amount. And he decided to take the train home. He had a little time in his hands, didn't want to get home too early. And the train went through Maine. So he's an escapee from America, and they're looking for his ID, and he sees them checking all the booths for the IDs, and he pretends that he's passed out and leaves his information on the seat, and they didn't wake him up at all, and they just accepted him, and he had a gun in his holster, he had his disguises in his briefcase, and he was shaking the whole time, he said.
I don't doubt he was.
Yeah. Hard to believe that guy shook, but.
To put this in perspective, the total was 59 banks that he robbed over 3 years, but in
And jewelry stores.
and jewelry stores, which primarily came later. It was banks in the beginning. In a half a year, he robbed 10 banks for $35,000. One of the mistakes he made was credit cards.
Yeah. I don't know much about the credit card thing, but he applied for credit cards and he got an American Express card and another card, and he used them everywhere. He wasn't using cash anymore. In fact, he robbed one bank in Montreal, went across the street and paid off his American Express as the police were arriving at the bank. It's unbelievable. But he would use his American Express and the other card. He'd go to Wally's in Pembroke, $1,000 a month. Beef and brand, $1,000 a month. But he would also use them in the cities where he robbed the banks. And of course, that left a trace of where he was, but of course, they didn't know he was robbing the banks, so they couldn't find out anything until he was arrested.
So while he's robbing banks, and there's not a lot of communication between police forces across Canada at this time, and so people aren't connecting the dots, they start to when he starts to target Burke's jewelry stores.
Mm-hmm.
But the communication doesn't go on for a long time, so police have no idea that the
No.
same guy that's doing a robbery in Vancouver is the same one that's doing one in Winnipeg and Ottawa and Toronto.
They had no idea, none whatsoever.
So when we get to the jewelry stores, the first one that he robs is in Sudbury, but he's starting to get into a situation where he needs more help.
Yeah. Jewelry stores had security. They had guards. They'd usually have a security guard in there. The jewelry stores that had a lot of, he would get a fence to go up to the jewelry stores, identify which jewels he should be stealing, and he always had to have an accomplice. He swears that it was always an American that he brought in. Probably not true. Another person was arrested eventually, and he was a Canadian, but he never ratted on any of his associates at all. But the jewelry stores were a problem because they had some security and he couldn't do it by himself. They were the only ones he couldn't do by himself.
But the payoffs were much greater than the banks.
Payoffs were great, except when you take it to a fence. So if he got $1 million, and that was his dream, because all the boys that he hung around with, you're not in the elite club until you steal $1 million. And his dream was to steal $1 million. So he had a plan to steal $1 million in one of the stores, and you only get 10, 15, 20% from a fence. He says he'd fence them himself in New York City every time. Doubtful that that's true, but that's what he told the police, that's what he did with them. But he'd only get 20%, so 20% of 63,000 in Sudbury is what he'd get.
Just for the benefit of the audience, a fence is?
The guy that buys the jewels
Thank you.
for him and gets rid of the jewels.
Okay.
Yeah.
The jewelry store heists, as they continue, there are some mistakes made. In one case, his accomplice leaves behind a sawed-off shotgun.
Yeah, it's the biggest case. It was $1 million worth of jewels. I think it was 1.2 million. It was Vancouver, Burke's job. He had cased that forever. He had the fence flew out with him a couple of times. Other people flew out with him a couple times. He had set up to do the job one night, and the guy faked an injury and pulled out. His accomplice pulled out, came into his room, said he'd cut his forehead, couldn't do the job. They had to fly back to Ottawa, and his accomplice flew back to the States. But he went there, I think, 6 times before he finally did it, and he saw the security guard. So he had an accomplice there. He was taking the jewels, and the accomplice was watching the guard, and the guard moved forward. The accomplice puts the shotgun in the guard's back and says, let's get out of here, Robert. So he makes this mistake. He calls the bandit by his first name, and then they're running down the stairs of the mall that the Burks was in, and this guy leaves his sawed-off shotgun and his disguises in the stair steps. Another bad mistake, because the sawed-off shotgun was stolen in Ottawa. So they trace it back to Ottawa, and suddenly this guy's in the news with the police, not in the news publicly, but the police are picking up some guy in Ottawa has robbed the Burks Bank, the Burks jewelry store.
And as the Burks jewelry store robberies are becoming more consistent, they're happening in different parts of the country, police are starting to talk. But there's also this undercover investigation that is underway in Ottawa, Carleton, that is around B&Es, break and enters, and it's actually, when they connect those two dots, that's how they get the Flying Bandit.
Yeah, they have a thing called Project Cafe, and they're trying to identify, there's all kinds of B&Es in the Ottawa area. And so they set up a squad to look into this stuff, and they kept following this one guy, and all of the stuff seemed to be going to this one guy in Ottawa in a bar. And they knew the gang, they knew the members of the criminals, but there was one guy that kept showing up. They didn't know who the heck he was. It was Whiteman, or Galvan, but they didn't know anything about him. So they started following him, trying to get some information, and learned that he lived in Pembroke. He had lived in Ottawa, now he was living in Pembroke with a wife and a child, and another child on the way.
When he sometimes maybe had too much to drink, let's be polite. And one night, this kind of talks about his personality, and I'm going to quote this out of the book, The Flying Bandit. He admits in the notes that you have, where he says, I was intoxicated. And he picked up the phone. He decided to call St. Joseph County Jail in Michigan, where he escaped from the United States. And this is what it says. The voice on the other side of the phone said, hello, St. Joseph County Jail. Robert said, hi, I'm Gilbert Galvan. How the blank are you? Do you miss me? Then he hung up. It was typical of him, an act on impulse, an act on the edge, to push somebody's button.
Yeah, he loved pushing buttons. But you know what? The guy had a great personality. I think every officer that interviewed him, dealt with him, knew that he had this personality. He could go either way, but he was a charmer, and he charmed. He was an usher for a guy's wedding, and was the hit of the wedding, got all the women up dancing and everything. And no criminal at all there. He was with his wife's friends, and they were not criminals. They were just innocent people, and he was the hit of the party, and they found him charming, and they just loved everything. And they thought he was this guy that delivered stocks and bonds. They had no idea that what he was doing, and he never really flashed around the money. He'd buy rounds and stuff, but he never flashed too much money.
Okay, let's talk about his arrest. It takes place on Friday, June 12th, 1987. It takes place here at the Pembroke area airport. What does that day look like for Gilbert Galvan?
That's a pretty interesting day because Project Cafe had closed in on him. They had tried to take it back a bit. Sean Smith, who was a constable in Pembroke, one of the best most police officers are great anyway, but he was really good, and there's George Snyder and Lyle McCharles was the inspector. Really, really good, efficient policemen and really busy guys. But they had followed him on this Project Cafe, and Sean had actually stopped him driving this. They were called the Chrysler Gang because all of them drove Chryslers. And Robert Whiteman was in Pembroke driving a black Chrysler, living on Dominion Street. It didn't fit. Didn't fit. And there was a drug dealer at the end of the street on Dominion Street. And Galvan knew that this guy was dealing drugs and just kept away. And he had a police radio going and everything. And Sean knew that there was a drug dealer on Dominion. So he stopped his car one day and asked for his license. And Whiteman said, oh, I left it at home. Well, I'll come by tonight and pick it up, see your license. So he drives at Dominion Street, knocks on the door, Whiteman answers, and Whiteman knows he's looking for something. And he's got pictures of the guy who lives down the street to see if he knows the drug dealer. He didn't even ask for his license. And Whiteman said, yeah, no, he's not even asking for my license. And he shows him the picture, and he knows he's looking for fingerprints, and he grabs the photo this way, and then drops it, and he says, no, I've never seen that guy. I don't know who he is or anything. So he knew something was up, and a couple of days later, they decide to raid his house on Dominion Street. They know he's going to be in Pembroke. That's what he does. He goes to Wally's and has Crown Royals and watches videos at night and brings home Wally's pizzas. But he's got a wife and a child, and that doesn't fit. Like, there's something wrong. She's innocent. She's well known. She's a good person and everything, and with a 9-month-old child. So Lyle McCharles and all the squad, they're all up there ready to raid the house. He's not home. So where the hell is he? They phone. He's not home. He's not there. Where is he? So they check the bus. Nope. Nobody's left on a bus. Nobody's left on the train. And then they're sitting there talking, and somebody says, well, I don't know, maybe Pem Air. And Lyle McCharles, the inspector, says, Pem Air, do they have an airport in Pembroke? Yeah. And so they phone the airport, and sure enough, he had chartered a plane to London. So they think he's escaped. They know he's going to go for the raid, and so he's leaving. So he phones the London police, and the guy on the other end says, holy God, I can't talk right now. There's a bank robbery. It was awesome. So they waited for the plane to land, and she was at the airport with the child, unfortunately, and he's getting off the plane. He paid the pilot $1,300 cash. He's got $1,600 here, he's got $1,500 here, he's got $1,400 here, he's got $20,000 in his briefcase. And he had stopped at the airport before he came back and bought 2 Ontario tickets because he thought it was going to be his lucky day.
By the way, that's true. Ed told me that over dinner, and Ed did extensive interviews with Gilbert Galvan when he was incarcerated.
Right.
And he told you that story.
Oh, yeah.
So you know it to be true.
So that's the day they had 2 guys come out on the tarmac, and he's walking in, and boom, they arrested him. And they looked at his briefcase, had the money in there, and his wife was there. And the one thing I remember that he said was, and then they said, what about the pilot? So what about the pilot? He got paid $1,300, so they had to go get the money off the poor pilot.
Who flew back to Toronto broke.
That's right.
He starts, the interrogation is, everything goes down here. The entire court case is handled in Pembroke. And he, during the interrogation, starts to confess to some of these crimes fairly quickly.
Yeah. The one good part of that story is his identification. They still don't know who he is. It's Robert Whiteman. They get his fingerprints. They send it to FBI. They send it to RCMP, Interpol. FBI comes back and says it's James Mears, who committed a burglary down in Las Vegas and got 8 years, but walked away from a rehab center. So they come in and say, oh, we got you now, James Mears. He said, oh, yeah, you got me. But he had been James Mears. So he'd got 8 years as James Mears down there. And they still didn't know who he was for a couple of days, and before he started confessing all these crimes. And then they found out it was Gilbert Galvan through Interpol. And he knew the gig was up, and he knew that his wife was, well, not very happy, obviously. And so he started confessing to a few bank robberies. He didn't have to confess to any of them. They had a partial print from one job, and they had him for the London bank robbery. That's all they had him for. But they started being bad cop, good cop thing, and he was allowed to call Wally, or Dan, at Wally's and order a pizza and some Crown Royal. They'd bring it back to the Pembroke offices, and he'd deliver the pizza to him. He couldn't believe it. Here he's talking to this guy, the bandit. And little things like that. And so he started confessing, give me a pizza, give me a couple of drinks. And, let me talk to my wife alone in the office for a couple hours, da-da-da-da. So a couple more jobs would be admitted. And he started admitting more and more. But they didn't have a clue what they had. And then he knew every robbery off by heart. How much? Exactly how he did it? There was a couple of places that the OPP had to call and confirm, and the city said, no, that bank doesn't, there's no bank. It doesn't exist anymore. They didn't even know about the robbery. Like, there was no record of it, and they had to convince them, and finally they found it in their archives that there was a bank, and it had been robbed, and exactly how he said it was robbed, and that's how they found out about Peterborough, and that guy's charges were withdrawn. And that's when I came in, and then when I called the OPP in Pembroke, it was Sean, and I can remember Sean just losing it. And all I knew is that they had a guy that had robbed the Peterborough Bank a couple of times and some other banks. And he said, what are you doing with that? And I said, well, I'm writing a story on it. This guy's case has been withdrawn. And within minutes, the inspector was on the phone. And by the next day, he was down in Peterborough talking to me and telling me that he had this guy that was confessing to robberies, and if we exposed it, he'd probably stop confessing. And they had him at 13 or 14 at that time. And they were afraid that if this got out, the confessions would stop. So we made a deal that he'd give me everything, and no other media, as long as I didn't tell anybody. And he'd keep me in touch every week, right up to, and this went on for months, and he kept his word on every promise he made. Lyle McCharles and Sean and George Snyder, excellent guys. And I dealt with them before, not these ones, but others where they broke their word and it didn't happen. These ones kept their word. Every week they updated me. Every week they informed me on which jobs, and it just kept going and going and going. It was unbelievable.
I've put up on the screen now, this is the totals, the 59 robberies that were committed by Gilbert Galvan, and the grand total, you can see $2,339,903. Vancouver was a favorite spot, 9 robberies. Toronto, 6. Ottawa, 12. Again, he was located there for much of his time. But you can see the breadth of this, and as you said, every province but 2, and only because they were islands.
Yeah. And the Regina and Winnipeg, both those cities, he robbed one bank, the police arrived, he was across the street at the other bank robbing it while they were there. Then he'd go to his hotel room, change, come back with a briefcase, they'd tell him to get lost, say, okay, you get a cab to the airport and fly home. Like, it was unbelievable. So 2 banks, same day, same time.
There were also some really, really impulsive robberies. There's a story about one in Ottawa where he literally did it on a small wager.
Yeah. There's a jewelry store where the fence said you could never rob this one jewelry store in Ottawa. He said, well, I could rob it, $100 bet. So the fence doesn't think anything of it. They're in a bar, and he has a couple of drinks, and he leaves. And the fence is leaving, getting in his car to leave. And he hears the tap on the window, looks, and it's Whiteman waving the jewelries. He says, where are you going? You owe me $100. Like, it's unbelievable. And the fence confirmed that story, and the bandit confirmed that story. Like,
let's talk about the houseboat story.
Yeah.
The rental of a houseboat here in Pembroke, from the Pembroke Marina, just down the walkway from us where we are today. And he decides to go for a little drive on the houseboat. You pick up the rest of the story from there.
Yeah. The publisher of this book, Tim Gordon, who's back at the back, he thinks this story should be told more because it would make a big tourist attraction for Pembroke. Because there might be jewels in that river. Yeah, he had rented a houseboat, and there were other guys with him. And they put, I don't know how they did it exactly, but 2 ropes on each side of the bank, and put the length there, and that's where they put the jewels in the river. So he had told the police that he had done this, and they took him out in a boat, and he wanted to go down into the water and escape. That's why That's why he wanted to tell them about this story. He figured if he could get out in a boat, he could get away. He was always trying to escape. And they went down, they put the scuba divers down and didn't find anything. There's two sides of it. Maybe they couldn't find it, but the ropes did match exactly how he had told them. And the other side of the story is maybe somebody ripped the bandit off when knowing that they were down there.
He spent time here, of course, at the Pembroke jail. No longer exists. It was an older jail at the time. Never tried to escape, to the best of our knowledge, from Pembroke. He might have probably thought about it. Actually, I think there was one time where he tried to get out of the detachment office I read about, but...
Well, they
set him up.
They set him up, yeah. They set him up and let him, they put a revolver on the desk, empty revolver. They deny this, and I kind of agree with the police. I don't think it happened, but he insists that it happened. But they put an empty revolver in, and he knew, and the other officer knew that it was empty, and but the guy that was coming in didn't know. So he comes in, he sees the bandit with the revolver, and this guy's shaking his boots. What the heck? What's going on? But they laughed about it and admitted everything. And then about 10 minutes later, the other cop says, well, let's see if he'll escape. And they left a door going, and sure enough, they did. But the police were there already. He was always trying to escape. Even during his sentencing, he wanted to have psychiatric assessment because he figured if he was driving to a hospital or something, he might be able to escape. But he was always trying to escape. And he had escaped many a times in the States.
You already talked about, the conversations you had with the police after you learned about the story. I'm just going to read again a little excerpt out of the book because I read it again on the weekend. I had read it a number of years ago, and it says, when Arnold called the Pembroke OPP detachment and began asking Sean Smith questions about the capture of Robert Whiteman, Smith was concerned. He said, Smith said, how did you find out about this? That's not the issue, Detective Smith, Arnold replied. I understand this guy might be the Burke's bandit. Oh, Smith explained. It's far too early to say something like that. I wouldn't say, or he might be the biggest bank robber the country has ever seen, Arnold probed. Now, Mr. Arnold, Smith continued, I think you're getting a bit carried away with this. As of right now, we don't know exactly what he's done. It's going to take some time. When we find out, we'll certainly let you know. From that came your deal, your exclusive deal to get access to the bandit. How many times did you interview him?
The deal was that if I didn't report it, they would keep me up to date and tell me about the court date and not let anybody else know about it, which worked, which it happened. The day he was sentenced, there was media there, but they didn't know he was from Pembroke, and it took 6 hours to read all the charges.
In front of some of you will remember Judge Russell Meridew. He was the presiding judge.
Right. And he was calling him Mr. Whiteman. This is incredible. Like, here's the guy, Gilbert Galvan, and the judge is calling him Whiteman. Whitman was what he was calling him. And Lyle had said, I'll get you, or I'll try to get you an exclusive interview at the jail. I had already written every story. It was already filed with Canadian Press. It was already waiting for the Peterborough Examiner. All I had to do was phone and say, yes, he got the 20 years, he pleaded guilty. And then Lyle said he's willing to talk to you. So he took me into the back of the courthouse where the jail cell was, and there was Gilbert. He had been in a blue navy jacket. He looked really good, and I had a mohair jacket on. First words out of his mouth after he just got 20 years was, nice mohair jacket. Like, he was really into the fashion. He never wore jeans or anything. He was just a fashionable guy. He liked to look good. And that was his first words, and we kind of hit it off, and then he started writing me from Millhaven prison and said he'd be interested in doing a book. So I went up to Millhaven. So the funny thing is, in the courtroom, he was sentenced as Gilbert Galvan, right? And the judge caught it and said, oh, that's a typo, it should be Galvan, make sure it's changed, okay, everything's good. So this guy, all his life has been given aliases, right? He's Whiteman, he's Mears, he's this guy, he's that guy. He goes into Millhaven, They book him as Gilbert Galvan. I have to sign the papers that I'm visiting Gilbert Galvan. I go in, and he's Gilbert Galvan. The government has set up an alias for him. That went on for a couple of years. It was unbelievable. I'd go in and say, I'm here to see Gilbert Galvan. Holy God.
So he goes to prison. What happens after that? He doesn't serve, well, let me take a step back. He tries to negotiate a deal. He ends up getting 20 years. He wanted only 15 years.
Right.
The Crown Attorney wanted 30 or 35.
30,
I think.
35, yeah.
But
Yeah.
he doesn't get what he wants, but he gets closer, and he doesn't serve that long, actually, in Canada before he's extradited back
No,
to the
he
U.S.
figured out if he got 20 years, it'd be 4 months for every robbery. So he figured that was a pretty good deal. Yeah, and things were going well in Pembroke. He kept confessing things, but the only deal was all the charges had to be heard in Pembroke. None of this stuff was given back. No money, no recovery, and no informing. He wouldn't inform on anybody, and that was all part of the deal. They agreed to it as long as he hadn't injured anybody. He never used his weapon, hadn't injured anybody physically. But if you're a teller in a bank, I think you're probably putting some trauma on a person. If you're a police officer, I mean, police officers, you gotta love them. Like, they have to they're dealing with this guy, and they're dealing with all the other crimes that are going on. And this guy took months to solve, and yet Sean and George and Lyle, they're on murder cases and everything else. So you have to, I'm a defender of the police, and that's the way it should be. But that was his deal, and they come back, and he kept confessing, and sure enough, there were no shots fired, there was no weapons used. He showed them, but so they agreed to the 20 years.
He was called the Burke's Bandit by the police because of all of the Burke's jewelry robberies. That was his
Right.
favorite target. You renamed him.
Yeah, I don't know why I did that, but so for my stories, I called him the Flying Bandit. There was another Flying Bandit that I didn't even know about, this Ken Leishman out west. He actually flew planes and went into cities and robbed banks, but I didn't know about that Flying Bandit. So I called him the Flying Bandit, and the first letter I got from the Flying Bandit was, "You've got to be kidding." He didn't like that nickname.
When the story broke, your stories now start going across the country. Here, the local Pembroke Observer, you were both owned by Thompson newspapers at the time.
Yeah.
You couldn't share with them.
I felt for that too, because they were there, they were in court, the radio was in court. They didn't catch on to it because they didn't know the guy had set up a false identity, had a child in Pembroke. All they knew is that there was some guy in prison come back to plead guilty to a bunch of crimes that had nothing to do with Pembroke. So that night on the wire, it went all over Canada, went around the world. And well, I felt for them because I know what was going on. It's their hometown, their paper, and they didn't have it. But they did get everything as a result. They were able to print the stuff. So
But the National Enquirer wanted the story.
National Enquirer, yeah.
They called you?
That was a good one. Yeah.
But you were getting calls from all over the place
Yeah.
by this point, right? So
Yeah, but by legitimate people.
Are you suggesting the Enquirer wasn't?
You'd have to read their story. Yeah.
I'm going to bring in just a few moments, Del O'Brien is with us tonight, who was the president of Pemair, where the Flying Bandit had his last flight on the day that he was arrested for the London bank robbery. But before we go there, just wonderful vacations. The Flying Bandit took care of himself at times.
Yeah, he went to the Turks, Caicos. Went to Bermuda. He got married in Bermuda. His wife actually got all the paperwork done. It cost him $354 for the marriage license, and they flew there. You didn't need passports to fly to Bermuda. And anytime he used a passport to fly, it was funny, like he was in Portugal one time, in England, and she wasn't with him. But she'd fly over later. And then he always had some reason that he couldn't fly back with her. So, because he had this guy Stafford as a passport. He got a legitimate passport. A lawyer signed it saying he'd known the guy for years and da-da-da. but he never used that passport with her, so she had no idea. Like, but they went all over like England. She had a cousin there. He was going to buy a bar in the Turks. That was his dream, and that was what he was willing to do. He had the 20,000 in his briefcase. He figured maybe 1 or 2 more jobs would be it, and he'd go to the Turks with her cousin, who was really interested in investing in a bar there. And then he got arrested, and everybody was in shock. Everybody, like, can you imagine the guy at Wally's? Holy God. But more so, can you imagine the family? Like, oh, holy.
So I'm going to ask for some assistance. If we could just bring Del up now, and we'll just throw a few bits of this conversation around Pembroke. Because, by the way, Del has also written a great book. If you haven't read it about Pembroke, I've enjoyed it very, very much. There it is. So a little bit of promotion for that. Del, grab a seat with us here for a second. And you have told me that you never actually met the Flying Bandit, but you certainly heard about him from some of the folks that you were friendly with, the pilots.
Well, certainly. I never met him, but he was the best passenger Pembroke ever had. He used Pembroke just repeatedly, as you knew. I went through a series of maneuvers in terms of his interest in robbing banks across Canada. First of all, Pembroke was a wonderful access to the city of Toronto to make a connection anywhere in the country. And it meant that he didn't leave a lot of trails. He'd just fly into Toronto and off to Pembroke in this neat little airplane and go undercover again. So he went through the first series of, our first experience with him was really when he flew from Pembroke to Toronto to make connections. And that went on for some time through a lot of these robberies. Our people very much liked him. He was very, very personable. Yeah. He'd arrive at the airport with his wife and a baby, well-dressed, very courteous. They had no idea. They thought he was just one of the nicest people that ever used the airline. And she would always come out and meet him. When he would be coming back in, she'd be arriving at the airport, again with a child, and meet him, and they'd leave. Everyone knew him in our ground crews, and thought he was a wonderful person. And he was, in terms of dealing with the Pembroke personnel. Very gifted man in his approach to other people. I can say, and I think you're aware of this, that Pembroke cooperated very much with the police in setting up the arrest and getting. Our crews were amazed when they found out from the police that what he was doing. But they cooperated and they followed him back to Pembroke, and the police were there when he arrived, and they had to sort of cover a bit to make sure that there wasn't a scene and bring him in. Anyway, it was all arranged. So that's really the story with Pembroke, and as I said, he was a great passenger for us. Everyone at Pembroke really was thought he was a great gentleman, and thought he was a good businessman. Didn't know, but knew that he made a lot of money, and he always paid his bills. And that's the story as far as Pembroke is concerned.
Thank you very much, Del, for sharing that. I'm going to close this out, Ed, with where is Gilbert Galvan now?
I have no idea.
You don't?
I don't. No, he was arrested back in 2015 for stealing liquor out of a liquor store. And I talked to the sheriff 2 days ago. Friday. And he had got 50 days, but not for those charges. They actually dropped those charges and he pleaded guilty to other charges. And that was back in 2015, and at that time he was in Lake Zurich, in Indiana, I think it was. And I've lost track of him since then. There is still interest in him, obviously, 30 years later. But now Tim got a call last week, just out of the blue, and there's an option for the movie rights been taken out. So I've always thought it'd be a better movie than a book. Bob Knuckle did a great job in this book, and I think the movie could be outstanding. And I would end it with him going into Millhaven as Gilbert Galvan. Like holy God, what an ending.
Well, that's a good way to end this evening, too. So we are going to call it a night at that. So thank you, Del, and thank you, Ed, for telling the story of the Flying Bandit.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching the story of Gilbert Galvan, who was arrested in 1987 here in Pembroke as Canada's most notorious bank robber, the Flying Bandit. I'm Jamie Bramberger. We'll see you next time. Good night. Very good. Very good. Thanks very much, Del.